Supporting Syria. It's hoped that billions of dollars will be pledged to help Syrians affected by the civil war in their country. But what about those whom the outside world can't reach, the communities inside Syria that find the battle is raging around them? And how is Bashar Al Assad's regime using siege as a means of war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. Today with me, Peter Dobby. Hundreds of thousands of Syrians are being intentionally denied food, water and medicine. It's a tactic used by most sides in the conflict in the fight over territory. According to the United Nations, close to 500,000 people are living under these conditions. They're among 4.6 million civilians regarded as hard to reach. Many of them are in areas blockaded by forces aligned with the Damascus government, such as Madaya, not far from the border with Lebanon, or Douma, near the capital itself. Rights activists accuse the government of using the sieges to force rebels to lay down their arms. Meanwhile, around 70 political leaders from across the world are in London for that donor conference to help the victims of the war in Syria. The aim is to raise up to $9 billion in aid. Some of the money will go towards those displaced inside the country. The funds will also assist people that have fled to neighbouring countries and onwards to Europe. But previous appeals for funding, well, they've fallen short. Last year, only 43% of around $2 billion, which was pledged to the UN, has actually been received. The British Prime Minister David Cameron laid out a number of goals he hoped the summit could help with, but pushed for help for Syrian people at a local level.
The long-term solution to the crisis in Syria can only be reached with a political transition to a new government that meets the needs of all its people. And we must continue to work towards that, however difficult it may be. But while we pursue a solution to this horrific conflict, we can also take vital steps now which will make a real difference to people's lives, both today and long into the future. We can provide the help that Syrians need now, with pledges of aid, food and medical supplies that will quite literally save lives this year and in the years ahead.
Well, a majority of those that have escaped war in Syria, well, they're now in Turkey. The Turkish Prime Minister said the funds will help his country to care for them.
Today, Turkey is hosting 2.5 million Syrian refugees. And Turkey, with these statistics, is the biggest refugee hosting country in the world. 700,000 school children are in Turkey. 300,000 are getting regular education, and we are planning to have this educational facility for all the rest.
Well, also at the London conference, Chancellor Angela Merkel pledged Germany would contribute $1.2 billion in financial aid.
Today we need to make sure we reflect so we can improve the humanitarian situation in Syria. We need to agree on a ceasefire. This is what the people expect in order to have a political transition away from the Assad regime. Today is about alleviating the plight of the people who are fleeing Syria. It's meant to be a day of hope for the people.
Well, let's bring in our guests to discuss our subject matter today. In London, Kevin John Heller, Professor of Criminal Law at SOAS, the University of London. Kevin is a specialist on international law. He's also a legal consultant and an advisor to the UN, as well as working on several high-profile trials. In Beirut, Bisan Saka, senior campaigner at the Syria campaign, and also in London, Julian Barnes-Dacey, senior policy fellow in the Middle East and North African programme for European Council of Foreign Relations. Julian, coming to you first. I know it's bad, the refugee situation in Europe, but are we concentrating on the refugee issue at the expense of what's going on with people inside Syria?
Well, I think it's clear that this is a band-aid option at the moment. We're so overwhelmed by the crisis. We're so out of any hope in terms of a near-term solution to the actual civil war, which is driving the humanitarian crisis. So I think Western governments in particular, of course, led by the Europeans, who have faced this inflow of refugees over the last year, are desperate to just try and do something, to do anything at the moment, to try and help alleviate, contain the wider contagion of the problem. Of course, there's focus, probably not enough, but there is focus on engaging and trying to work their political track in terms of some kind of end to the civil war. But everyone's very realistic that at the moment, the best you can do is hope to work these Band-Aid solutions, frankly.
And Bisan Saka, in Beirut, we're talking as well about 6 million people displaced inside the country. I mean, the number is, one can't comprehend what it must be like to be one of those people. Are we talking about a solution that is viable, perhaps?
I think that the only way, if we're talking in terms of the refugee crisis or in terms of internally displaced people, I think we need to address protection issues. I think that's the only way that this crisis is alleviated. You have to break the siege on 1 million people who are starving. You have to free the detainees who are being tortured, and you have to stop the bombs that are right now the biggest killer of civilians. It's only by protecting civilians that you can start to address these crises.
Kevin John Heller in London. We're talking now as well about torture. We're talking about starvation. Are we also discussing the realistic prospect of all of that being a war crime?
Well, there are certainly a number of war crimes that would be covered by those kinds of behavior. Obviously, the laws of war categorically prohibit using starvation as a method of war, and it's a war crime as well. International humanitarian law, the laws of war, also prohibit impeding humanitarian assistance missions. And of course, things like torture and the intentional attack of civilians and civilian objects, all of those things can be prosecuted as a war crime under the right circumstances.
I just want to play in some footage for you, some drone footage that we've obtained from the sky above the Syrian city of Homs. Now, we'll carry on playing this as we carry on discussing the issues. You can see scenes there reminiscent of the aftermath of World War II in Germany, mile upon mile upon mile of what looks like the reality of a scorched earth process, a scorched earth policy. Julian Barnes, Mr. de Mistura is in effect using the London conference surely as leverage and the desire to help those internally displaced people. But the delegates that this programme spoke to in Geneva last week didn't seem particularly bothered about the collateral damage. Neither, of course, does the Syrian regime. But why were the rebels, speaking through the voice of who would be their politicians in some future Syria, why are they not concerned?
Well, it's a brutal, desperate civil war, and it's a battle that's been going on for 5 years. I think this is seen as a fight for existential survival at the end of the day between the two sides. And frankly, the debris and the destruction and the human tragedy that they've left behind, first and foremost, the regime has long ago abandoned any pretense at concern for that. But increasingly, of course, the rebels have had to push aside those concerns if they've focused on fighting the regime. So, it's a desperate, brutal war. And to address the point of protection that was raised earlier on by one of the other guests, I think the unfortunate problem here is that the Russians have backed the Assad regime militarily to such a huge extent that if you are going to break the sieges and if you are going to stop the barrel bombing and so on and so forth, you effectively need the West or regional states to go to war against Russia and the Iranians and the Syrian regime in Syria. And no one is prepared to do that. The cost is seen as even higher than the ongoing destruction and tragedy unfolding. So there are a series of bad options. De Mistura is scraping the barrel to try and get some kind of track moving, but no one wants to end it. Everyone is still focused on victory at the price of the Syrian people.
And Bisan Saka, when you hear the British Prime Minister David Cameron saying a lot of this money that they're looking to be pledged after the London conference will be spent on education. Education is fine, but I'm tempted to say cart before the horse. How do you get the mechanisms of education into those places inside Syria? How do you get them, say, into the refugee camps in Jordan? Because I think Jordan's second or third biggest city, it's not a city, it's a refugee camp.
I think by focusing on the issue of education, it is the right step forward, and especially if they're speaking to host countries like Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon about what needs to be done, about the bureaucratic measures that need to be taken, because this is the future of Syria. These are the kids that are going to rebuild the country, so investing in them is great. But inside Syria, I mean, the reality is you can't educate these children if schools are being bombed. And the Russians and the regime are bombing schools at the moment. Under siege, you have kids that are going to school, but they're passing out. We know a doctor that treated a young student who had passed out because she had no food to eat. And he asked her mom, why aren't you feeding her before she goes to school? And the mom says, well, she has siblings and I have to pick which child I'm going to feed each day. So that's the reality of education in Syria. I mean, you have to feed people, you have to make sure that they're surviving the bombs in order to then educate them.
Well, the war in Syria now well into its fifth year almost. During the course of the conflict, the government has lost control of most parts of the country. Currently, the government holds between 15 and 25% of the territory that now makes up Syria, including the capital and coastal provinces. The rest of the country, well, that's in the hands of the opposition fighters, the rebels, and, of course, ISIL. But Bashar Al Assad's regime still rules over 75% of Syria's Arab population. So when members of the government delegation turned up in Geneva for talks on ending the war, they knew they were walking in from a position of strength. Let's go back for a second to Kevin John Heller. Just to be clear on one particular point, the legality of what's going on. Everyone is saying that Bashar al-Assad is utterly ignoring the norms, the strictures of international law. Could we apply that to everyone else involved in what's going on in Syria?
Well, I think that's part of what makes the problem so intractable, is that this isn't a simple situation in which bad guy, Syrian government, good guy, everybody else. It's kind of pick your bad guy or degrees of being a bad guy. Certainly the rebels don't have completely clean hands in all of the fighting. They've engaged in siege warfare. They've engaged in all of the same kinds of atrocities that the government has, although certainly not to the same degree as Bashar al-Assad. And then, of course, then you add in a terrorist group like ISIL, who have absolutely no respect at all for the laws of war or international law, and who are really more bloodthirsty than I think even the most pessimistic of us could have ever imagined. It's an extremely difficult situation to try to figure a way out of, because you can't just point your finger at one group and say they should be the government, they should be the ones to go forward. They're all problematic to some extent. It's, as I heard before from Julian, it's the least bad option that is the only thing that we can look for.
On that idea, Julian, of a least bad option, when it comes to the people who are besieged inside the country, if somebody involved in this chaos has got to blink first, does it by definition have to be the Russians?
Well, no, I think on the contrary, the Russians and the Assad regime, with the support of the Iranians on the ground, are in the position of strength, and they are dominating the battleground. We see in the last couple of days that they've made significant advances around Aleppo, cutting off rebel supply lines. They are not going to blink because they have the upper hand, and it's quite clear that the regional actors, that the Western actors, neither are prepared nor have the capability to shift that balance on the power. So I think, frankly, if someone needs to blink, it's going to have to be those on the side of the opposition who, as they have elsewhere, have opened up ceasefires, have given up their guns to allow aid and food into some of these besieged areas. But tragically, that is the only way out of this logic of this tragedy that we're seeing unfolding. And I think that's probably, tragically, also going to be the means of de-escalating the broader conflict, whereby the opposition are forced to accept that the regime and Assad himself stay in some kind of position of authority for some time going forward, albeit one that hopefully and should be matched with significant compromises. But so long as both sides demand this zero-sum victory, everyone is condemned to further destruction and misery.
Beseiged, why should the opposition blink first? Why should the opposition do what Julian is outlining they should do if, for example, and these are only reports and they may be apocryphal, apparently the United Nations knew about Madaya as far back as July, but the decision was taken by somebody within the UN not to illuminate that as a major issue because they didn't want to be seen to be revealing it and therefore presumably dealing with it?
I mean, first off, I would disagree a little bit on the issue of ceasefires. I don't think that we should encourage it as the only way that this conflict ends. Because what happens is that the local ceasefires that we've seen now have been a result of the Assad regime's surrender or starve policy. They surround a town, people begin to starve to death, they can't get treated. So then they're able to then go into the town. If we say local ceasefires work, then what we're doing is we're encouraging more sieges to happen. And that's the worrying part about what's happening in Aleppo right now, which is that one of the key supplies has been cut off. If Aleppo goes under siege, if 400,000 go under siege, that's catastrophic. So we need to fight the surrender or starve policy. I actually believe that the opposition is blinking first. I think they're going to the negotiations and they're saying, we want these promises to be fulfilled. We want these people to be protected, and it's their right to do so. I think there's been far too much hand-holding of the Assad regime, and that's what the United Nations has done, unfortunately.
Why do you say the opposition is blinking first? Because with all due respect to you and the job you fulfilled there in Beirut, the people we spoke to in Geneva, they're not in a mood for blinking first. They couldn't even arrive at the same time. They had to be coaxed onto a plane, particularly the Riyadh grouping. They had to be coaxed off the plane, and then they weren't negotiating. They were very firm about that. We are not negotiating. We are not talking. We still have a line in the sand. And as we've seen, Staffan de Mistura had to accept the talks have not collapsed in Geneva, but they've certainly been put on hold.
It is a catch-22. I think the Higher Negotiations Committee, the people that met in Riyadh, actually have the support of the Syrian street, which is unprecedented because the political opposition has never had the support of the Syrian street before. If they were to say, okay, well, we'll make this compromise, okay, we will get there at this time, if they were to give in too quickly, they would lose the support of the street, and then the negotiations would completely collapse anyway.
Kevin John Heller, as far as what the UN knew and when it knew it, is there any international law that covers what the UN should have arguably told the outside world about Madaya 6-7 months ago now, and the issue of culpability?
Well, I mean, there's nothing really in international law that governs that directly. The United Nations is in an extraordinarily difficult position. On the one hand, their list that they maintain of areas under siege is important in terms of attracting international attention and focusing international efforts. But at the same time, insofar as there is no military solution on the horizon to this problem, and insofar as the Assad regime isn't going anywhere anytime soon, the UN has to kind of balance the shaming aspect of this list with trying to actually get humanitarian assistance to the people inside the sieges. And I can understand the frustration of this area is listed, then it's delisted, then it's not listed quickly enough again. But ultimately, I think the touchstone has to be, is the UN maximizing its ability to get assistance to the people who are being besieged by really all of the various parties to the conflict? And so I think we have to be a little sympathetic to the position that the United Nations finds itself in, given that there is no more dramatic option other than trying to get along with the various parties to the conflict.
Well, the use of siege as a weapon of war is not confined, of course, to Syria. In Iraq, the army has blockaded Fallujah for about 3 months now. The city's controlled by ISIL. Government troops have blocked most basic supplies from reaching the city with the aim of forcing ISIL to leave the area. Julian Barnes-Dacey, should we be dealing with another suspicion? The suspicion is this, that the Obama administration is so risk-averse because of what happened in Iraq 2003, 2004, that they are blind to the consequences of inaction on their part when it comes to pushing to get something done on the ground inside Syria.
Well, frankly, I don't know when one speaks of action, what that would look like and how it would unfold and how you would control the consequences. I think that I have sympathy for the Obama administration because the Syria conflict is a series of wars, a domestic series of wars. You have regional players on all sides. The Russians have intervened militarily. I think the American administration, Obama, is extremely cautious about wanting to go in there, given the failures of Western interventions in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and Libya, in environments that frankly weren't half as complicated as Syria is today. I think everyone recognizes that the only way you're going to get the kind of necessary de-escalation in Syria is actually by pushing the different parties to the negotiating table, squeezing compromises out of them. The minute the US engages more actively, my impression is that that gives the message to one side, you can win this. So I think that actually just fuels the cycle of conflict. It fuels the counter-escalation of the Russians and the Iranians, and we've seen this for 5 years now. One side intervenes, the other side intervenes, and so on and so forth, and it's been a disastrous catastrophe and choice of policies. So I don't see where you could really say that the Americans could make a clear, coherent, positive difference, whereas you can look at the scene, the environment, and see the downsides and the risks of getting deeply involved again.
Bisan Saka,
I think I'd like to...
Pardon me, John, carry on.
May I echo that?
Yes.
I just want to echo what Julian said. I think we have to view the prospects of military action in Syria through the lens of previous military interventions. If you think about what happened in Libya, it was supposed to be about civilian protection. It ended up being about regime change. It completely alienated Russia and China, and part of their intransigence towards Syria is a direct consequence of feeling taken advantage of by the United States in the Libyan situation. And Libya is now essentially a completely failed state that doesn't even have one government. So the idea that we can simply escalate the conflict from outside and get anywhere, I just find kind of horrifying. I mean, if you think about Hillary Clinton endorsing a no-fly zone in Syria, well, it sounds great in the abstract, but it's not so great the first time an American fighter shoots down a Russian fighter, and then you really have an international armed conflict. So I think the idea that we can fight our way out of the Syria problem is somewhat illusory.
Bisan Saka in Beirut, it seems to me we've got three issues on each side of the divide here. We've got money, diplomacy and bombs going on today. That's the reality. The consequences of that, that's death, injury and starvation. The Norwegian Prime Minister, co-chairing the London conference, is saying this is about hope. Hope is not an emotion. Hope is a promise. So how long until they deliver on that promise?
I think this is the issue. I think the issue is a matter of political will, and it's about putting their foot down and deciding that protection is a priority. And that's how the war ends. I don't think that the war is going to end on its own or that they're going to come to the negotiating table. The Russians and the regime right now, they're pursuing a military solution to this conflict with impunity because no one is standing in their way. In terms of what the U.S. can do, the first time that the U.S. actually put their foot down after the chemical weapons attack in 2013, they got their first Chapter 7 resolution. The regime blinked and they destroyed their chemical weapons stockpile. That's what happens when the U.S. wants to do something. But right now, the message that they're sending is, yes, continue to kill people, continue to kill civilians. We're not going to do anything about it. And that level of impunity is making negotiations impossible right now.
Julian, when it comes to putting your foot down, to pick up on that phrase from Bisan Saka in Beirut, I mean, Assad has spent the past 3 weeks consolidating his position. He's up against the Victory Army. It's Ara al-Sham, magnetized with al-Nusra. So underneath that umbrella, different militia groups felt very comfortable. So each side is as entrenched as they have been for a long time. But Bashar Al Assad is there, and there he stays.
Absolutely, and I think it's clear that the Russian military intervention is now bearing fruit from their perspective. A few months in, you have significant advances in the south and the center territories, and now in the north, most strategically in terms of cutting off Aleppo. So Assad is sitting strong, he is feeling comfortable, and certainly that is reflected in his negotiating position, and that of the Russians and the Iranians as well. I think it reflects the reality guaranteed by the Russian intervention that Assad is not going away. The minute that Moscow deployed aircraft over Syrian skies, it became a non-negotiable that Assad would have to be part of the political process moving forward. The question is in what capacity? And I think, yes, in an ideal world, the West would be able to put its foot down and make them blink and push them back. But if you're going to do that, you have to effectively be willing to go to war. And I think in this conflict, and as I say, in the history and the cycles of escalations and counter-escalations, the lesson is that there is no clear path to victory. And actually, the regime can blink on something like chemical weapons because it was an easy give. But if actually you're talking about its existential survival, you're talking about core Iranian interests in terms of maintaining their grip over some of the central areas and maintaining ties with Hezbollah, those are non-negotiables for them. So those will need to be militarily squeezed out of the Assad regime and its backers if you really want to get them, absolutely.
We are out of time. Thank you all to the guests, Kevin John Heller, Bisan Saka and Julian Barnes-Dacey. And to you for your time here on Inside Story. You can get more on our programmes, of course, via the website, aljazeera.com, or do check into our Facebook page facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can tweet us at AJ Inside Story or tweet me. I'm at Peter Dobby1. Thanks for watching. We'll do it all again at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye for now.